Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Thank you all for joining me for this halaqah of tafsir. Tonight, inshallah, we will comment on Surah Al Baqarah, dealing with verses regarding the just application of warfare. So we will be looking, inshallah, at Surah Al Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran, verses number 189 forward. So let me begin by praising all our Creator and Fashioner. I ask Him to send peace and blessings upon all of His prophets, His messengers. I ask Him to bless all of you tonight who have come out to join me for this meeting, those who are joining me in the Toronto area via Zoom, and others who are joining us worldwide via live stream on my Facebook page. So let me share my screen with you, and that will get us into a presentation that I've prepared for this very purpose. So here we go. So I will start this. Let me see here, slideshow, and from the beginning. And here we are. So rules governing justified warfare, Quran, Surah 2, verses 189 to 195. We dealt with, under a broad heading about laws, new laws for a new community. Under that broader heading, we have dealt with dietary regulations. We've dealt with laws of restitution and inheritance. This is all in previous weeks. We have dealt with rules regarding fasting. And this week, we're dealing with regulations governing justified warfare. So to be more clear, we're dealing with new laws for a new community in Surah Al-Baqarah. That began with verse 168, and that will extend all the way to verse 283. So within that, we covered a lot of topics, and now for tonight, we will be so we dealt with dietary regulations, laws of restitution and inheritance, rules regarding fasting. And now, tonight, inshallah, we will be dealing with regulations governing justified warfare from verses 189 to 195. Not many verses there, but I have to discuss some background before getting into these verses, and that will occupy us a bit. So, to continue, in history, humankind have suffered greatly through wars, and wars were largely unregulated, and that led to worse results from war than if war could have been regulated. And so thinkers over time have tried to think about how to regulate war so that the atrocities we have noticed in the past can be curtailed and human lives can be saved. War is devastating, and sometimes it seems even necessary, at least from the point of view of those who are trying to fix the problem. And it seems that war is the only solution. Nonetheless, even in entering into war, there has to be some procedures that everyone can agree upon to ensure that the worst results of war do not ensue. So theorists have come up with what is referred to as a just war theory. Of course, there's not just one, but many. But over time, the thinking of various philosophers have solidified into some common elements. Some of these elements are discussed in this course, whose graphic is shown here on this screen, a course by Professor Andrew Wilson. This is entitled Masters of War, History's Greatest Strategic Thinkers. Of course, this course is dealing not only with just war theory, but just war theory is one of the chapters within this larger study. So this is part of the Great Courses series offered by the Great Courses company in the United States of America. This particular course is delivered on 4 video discs, and the discs are available for free rental at the Toronto Public Library. It comes together with a written handbook to guide you through the video content. Very informative, and all you need for this particular discussion tonight is to focus on the chapter regarding just war theory. I also benefited greatly from this book entitled When God Says War is Right by Darrell Cole. The subtitle is The Christian's Perspective on When and How to Fight. So this book details the verses of the Bible that can be called into the service of those who are going to war, and refers to many great Christian thinkers who have contributed to the development of the just war theory. Now, we would recall that Christianity existed before the religion of Islam as we know Islam now in its present form. Some of these Christian thinkers predate Islam. However, some of what now forms the just war theory have come after our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, from thinkers outside of Islam. And what would be interesting is for us to see that the Quranic verses we are about to encounter in Surah Al-Baqarah actually give us prescriptions and stipulations that conform with just war theory, and we will see the details of that. Now, what are the characteristics of a just war according to these great thinkers outside of Islam? They give us stipulations under three broad categories. One is what has to be done prior to war. Two, what is to be done within war, and three, what is to be done in the aftermath of war. So the thinking has been stratified in this way, categorized, so that each area can receive its due focus. What are we going to do before even going into war? And while we're in a war, how might we conduct ourselves? And when the war is all over, is our responsibility done, or do we still have principles and ethical standards by which to govern ourselves? So we'll look at each in turn. First, prior to war. The points that are given by the thinkers are not necessarily given in this particular sequence that I've laid out here, but these are the main points. And some may subdivide some of these points to include, eventually they might end up with a larger number than 6 points, but these are fairly commonly described as the principles of going into a just war. So in my numbering, one, it should be declared by a proper authority. Two, it should be entered into as a last resort. That's after you tried everything else, that's when it comes about. As for one, we should say when we talk about a proper authority, recently some people have claimed that they're going to war on behalf of the Muslim Ummah. And the rest of the Ummah are wondering, like, who placed these people as authorities over us to call war on our behalf? They're not our authorities. So that's an important point, that it must be declared by a proper authority. And in the time of our Prophet, peace be upon him, the undisputed authority among the Muslims was the Prophet, peace be upon him. So he could be our representative and he could call it when it is time to go to war. So declared as a proper authority, it must be as a last resort. So we've tried everything else to achieve a just settlement of whatever problem we were trying to deal with, but nothing works. And in the end, we have no other recourse but to go to war. Three, must be done with the right intention. It's interesting that they put this point in because as Muslims know, having the right intention or the right niyyah for any good deed is a prerequisite. And here we see that they have included this as well. Not as a religious principle. They're not thinking, okay, you must have the right intention to please God. Maybe some of the Christian thinkers thought that way. But philosophers who are independent of religious affiliation would also include this. And what do they mean by this? It means, for example, if you are going after a tyrant, let's say in the Middle East, but in the back of your mind, you know that it's not really the tyrant that's the driving force behind your intention to go to war, but really you want to go there to secure the oil for your own purposes. Well, then your intention is hazy, it's mixed up, and it's not a clear intention that you're only going to remove an oppressor. So you must go into it with the right intention. And four, it must be pursued with proportionality. So you're going to call a war. Well, I mean, is it really a war that is needed to fix the problem that you're talking about? Or is it something else? And even if it's called a war, like how big is this war going to be? Like how many foot soldiers, for example, you're going to have on the ground? So it has to be proportional. It cannot be that because you have a lot of power, you're going to use all of your power here. Like you know, it's not elegant to use a sledgehammer to swat a fly. So you have to use the appropriate tools, the appropriate measure to deal with the particular problem. It's a big problem, but then you use a bigger tool. It's a small problem, then you use a smaller tool. That, you know, basically, obviously, you know, it's not a question of big and small, but you get the idea of proportionality. Five, it must be for a just cause, and a just cause could be self-defense, or it could be to correct a grave public injustice that otherwise would not have been solved without going to war. And six, when there is a reasonable expectation of success. And that means that you're not going to enter into a war and then the result is going to be worse than what you began with. So you began with the problem that you were trying to fix. Now you entered into a war and you're not successful in the war. You did not reach your goal, whether it be to remove an oppressor or some other goal. And then in the end, all you have is a lot of dead soldiers and a lot of devastation and destruction, perhaps on both sides. And you still did not remove the oppressor. So in that case, what was the whole point of the war in the first place? And so there must be a reasonable expectation of success. Now, you can see why I have ordered them the way I did, because I ordered them in this way so that the whole thing can read like a prose. So, for example, I would say that a just war is one that is declared by a proper authority as a last resort with the right intention and pursued with proportionality in self-defense or to correct a grave public injustice when there is a reasonable expectation of success. So the whole thing for me reads like prose. Okay, so that's before going into war. But now you're in the war itself. Okay, your responsibilities do not end, but you have to govern yourself in a proper way. One, there should be non-combatant immunity. So you can't be killing women and children, people who are devoted to religion, those who are not part of the war. They're not fighting against you, and so you cannot fight against them. Two, there should be, again, the problem of proportionality. So we were looking at proportionality from the point of view of going into war, but now even while you're within the war, you still have to be governed by this principle of proportionality, because within the war, there will be some smaller objectives. So you're going to attack the enemy camp at a specific time. That's within the larger war. And so, you know, the old saying, they've won the battle, but they lost the war. So there are battles within the war. So for each battle or each military maneuver, there has to be a justification based on proportionality. You're not going to apply more force than is necessary. Three, military necessity. Like, is it really what you're doing at the moment? Is that necessary from a military point of view? It cannot be like, you know, you just see an enemy soldier, you say, okay, let's take him out, because at the moment he may not be posing any danger, and taking out that one soldier at the moment it's not like a military objective. It doesn't really add to the overall scheme of what you're trying to accomplish. It's not like two groups are battling against each other and you must kill them to save yourself. So the question of military necessity for each operation. Four, it must be in accordance with international law. Five, it must involve the non-use of immoral means. So some means are immoral by themselves. You can't use those. For example, if we hear that some soldiers are using rape as a means of demoralizing the enemy, well, that's haram from a Muslim perspective, as you know, but it is also thought by theorists that this is wrong. You cannot use that. And 6, the non-use of weapons whose effects cannot be controlled. So under this comes weapons of mass destruction. If you're going to use weapons and you cannot really control for the effect of this, well, then, you are not really doing good for the world. You could be doing much more harm than the intended result that you sought through your military intervention. And 7, there must be the just treatment of prisoners of war. The verses we are about to study in Surah Al-Baqarah do not deal with prisoners of war. We will find that being discussed in Surah 47 and also in the 8th chapter of the Quran. But nonetheless, I've included this here so you can see the broad principles that govern going into a war and how to govern yourselves within the war. Now, even after the war is over, your responsibilities are not done because here too you have what do you do with the surrendered other side? Well, you need to distinguish between military heads and others. The punitive measures may be applied against the military heads, but those who are not directly involved in at that level of planning have to be spared. And we know from the Quran that it's some are referred to as a'immatul kufr, the heads of the disbelief. And it's not all of the people who will be included when it comes to punitive measures. And of course, punitive measures are not the necessary way of dealing with things. If that is beneficial, then that may be used, but mostly we're looking for peace, reconciliation, and making the other group feel that they have received a fair outcome so that they can become participants in the global community. It's just because they're defeated doesn't mean that they have to be totally humiliated. And again, here the principle of proportionality comes into view. And much more could have been said about this, but the idea about the just war principles for after war, this is still being discussed. It is a new category that recently came into view. And yet we will see that in the Quran, there are stipulations, for example, how to deal with, as we mentioned previously, the prisoners of war, which overlap into the after-war scenario, because you might exchange prisoners, for example, and the Quran gives you stipulations for all of that. So now, let me move on to the Quranic picture. And to understand the Quran, we have to understand two things. One is we have to understand the historical context in which the Quran has been revealed. And two, we have to understand verses of the Quran within its own context, within the textual apparatus of the Quran itself. So we need to understand the circumstantial history, and we also need to understand the textual context. So historical context, textual context. So as for the historical context, let's look at that in a little bit of detail before we get to the verses. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his followers were persecuted in Mecca for 13 years. This was the hometown of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Then the Prophet, peace be upon him, migrated to Medina, leaving that scene of violence behind. This diagram shows a likely route that the Prophet, peace be upon him, took as he migrated to Medina. He took one route while the enemies were expected to take another route. So the enemies would have taken the red route, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, took the green one, thus having little interaction and being mostly non-parallel with the group taken by his pursuers. So they were out to kill him. The Prophet, peace be upon him, migrated safely through that long and arduous journey. We have now entered a new Hijri year. And the Hijri year obviously starts with a recollection of the year in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, migrated. So that's the year one of the Hijri, year two, and so on. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, migrated to Medina. Let me make sure I get my slides in order here. So he migrated to Medina, and here we have in this map of Saudi Arabia the Mecca being shown in the lower with the lower arrow, and Medina with the other arrow. So Medina is to the north of Mecca, about 400 kilometers. It's not a short trip nowadays by car. It may take you 6 hours or so, maybe 4 hours, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, must have traveled for weeks before he reached his destination using the modes of transportation at the time. Now, I'm painting this picture so you can see that over time, the Prophet, peace be upon him, would have faced many enemies attacking him from Mecca at and around his new place of residence in Medina, where he eventually died and he was buried. So this map shows you Medina looking more prominently, and below it is Mecca, but nothing new there. What is new on this slide now is the place of Badr, which marks the place where the battle of Badr was fought. That's in the second year of the Hijrah, after the Prophet, peace be upon him, migrated. And you can see that the folks marched from Mecca down below and came to confront the Muslims at Badr. The Muslims merely left Medina to go and meet the enemy at Badr, thus preventing the enemy from entering their city. Because in those days, the enemies would enter the city, they would rape, they would kill, they would plunder, they would burn, they would destroy the city and its people. So the Muslims wisely met them at Badr. And so that is the place of the Battle of Badr. Now, the following year, the Muslims had to confront them at Uhud. So here we have also the place of Mecca and the place of Badr and Medina showed on this map. So you can see that Badr is in between Mecca and Medina, but it is closer to Medina, and that is where that battle was fought. So if we're asking, if we didn't know any more details and we're asking, well, who was attacking whom, it is obvious that it is the Meccans who were attacking the Muslims, and the Muslims were defending themselves in and around their city of Medina. So I mentioned Uhud. I'm going to go on to Uhud now. So here we have the map showing the city of Medina, and then to the north of it is Uhud. And you will remember that Mecca is to the south. And that means that the enemies marched against the Muslims by going farther north with the intention of attacking Medina from the north. And there, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his companions met them at Uhud, and the battle was fought. Many of the Muslims died. And to this day, when Muslims make pilgrimage to Mecca and they visit Medina, or Umrah, and they visit Medina, they also go to visit Jabal Uhud, and they see the burial ground there where 70 of the Shuhada were laid to rest. These were Shuhada from the Battle of Uhud. So you can see then that, again, the geography of these battles point to the fact that the Meccans were marching for weeks with their armies. And of course, we spoke about weeks when we said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, made his migration. But now you have to think of the whole army. Sometimes they were accompanied by their women and children as well, in order to goad them on to the battle. They had all of their military equipment, which could be heavy, and so on. So it would take them longer to move. So that means for all of this time, they're marching and moving against the Muslims, and they're intent on going to attack and to kill the Muslims. The Muslims were merely defending themselves and defending their city. And now we come to the Battle of the Trench, the Battle of Khandaq, in the 5th year of the Hijrah. And here we see that a trench was dug, and see the label here. with the arrow pointing to the trench. And you see where the Prophet's mosque is. So that would be the city of Medina down below. Again, the non-Muslims marched and tried to attack the city from the north because that's the vulnerable point. It is in the north then that the Prophet, peace be upon him, dug a trench between the volcanic rocks on the one side and another obstacle on the right, so as to prevent the enemy from advancing and demolishing the city. And after they waited it out, you see the many different groups that joined in this battle. So it was called the Battle of the Allies, or Al-Ahzab, and Surah 33 of the Quran mentions this event, and so it is called Surah Al-Ahzab. So here the Prophet, peace be upon him, again was practicing a defensive measure by staving off the enemy advance by digging that trench, he and his companions. In this situation, we can understand why the Quran would give permission to the Muslims to fight back against those who are attacking them and who have actually driven them out from their homes in the first place, as mentioned in Surah Al-Hajj, the 22nd chapter of the Quran, verses number 39 and 40. So all of this forms the background of both the historical context and also the textual context of the Quran as a whole, to see how the Quran is dealing with the question of war and peace. So peace is the default situation, and war is brought upon the Muslims by the enemy advances, and the Muslims find it necessary to defend themselves. The Quran gives them that permission to defend themselves. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, is in Medina, and these are the verses that are being revealed to him in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is a Medinan revelation, starting with verse number 189. O Prophet, they're asking you about the crescent moons. Say, they indicate the passage of time for people and for the pilgrimage. It is not righteousness that you approach houses from their rears, according to all superstitions, but righteousness is seen in the person who is conscious of Allah. So enter houses via their front doors and be conscious of Allah so that you may be successful. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with the question of war? Well, this verse will connect with the question of war because there are 4 months in the Islamic calendar of 12 months, which are declared to be sacred months. And in these months, Muslims are not allowed to initiate fighting, and you will see the discussion of that in the verses that follow. So that's a connection here. And the sacred months are related to the Hajj, because this would be the time that people would be making either Hajj or Umrah, and safety is declared during this period. So with no one initiating war, the pilgrims can have safe passage to go and perform the Hajj, especially in the months of Hajj, 1 month before the Hajj month and 1 month after. So Muharram is the last of these 3. There's Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, and Muharram. And so people might be either going to Hajj or coming back from Hajj. So a general truce is understood to be in place, so nobody gets into a war at this time. Pilgrims can travel safely. And then Rajab, standing alone, that may be the time when people would perform Umrah, and then too, all wars must cease. So this is the connection between the sacred months and the Hajj and the question of war. So going to verse number 190, fight in the way of Allah against those who are fighting against you, but do not be aggressive. Allah does not love aggressive people. From this verse, we know that Muslims are not allowed to attack non-combatants, which, as you know, is one of the principles of a just war. You must distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Non-combatants have to have immunity. So Muslims are not allowed to be aggressive. We're allowed to defend ourselves against our attackers, but we can't be aggressive because Allah does not like aggressive people. Verses 191 to 192, thus you may drive them out of the places from which they drove you out, and you may even slay them wherever you encounter them, if killing the persecutor is a necessary evil to prevent persecution. But do not fight with them at the sacred mosque unless they initiate a fight with you therein. If they persist in fighting you, you may slay them. This is what such disbelievers deserve. But if they restrain themselves, then Allah is forgiving and merciful. So if they stop fighting you, then we know that Allah is forgiving and merciful, and we ourselves want to copy Allah by being forgiving and merciful to the enemy as well. Verse 193. Fight them until the persecution ends and ethics are enforced for Allah's sake. But if they desist, then let there be no hostility except against aggressors. 194. Equal retaliation is justified for all violations. So, if they are aggressive towards you, you may be aggressive against them to the same extent. If they fight you during a sacred month, you may likewise fight them during a sacred month. Be conscious of Allah, knowing that Allah is with those who are careful to not violate limits. So we could not initiate a fight during a sacred month, but if they're fighting us during the sacred month, we could actually respond by defending ourselves. We enter into the battle for self-defense, regardless of when, because just because it's a sacred month doesn't mean that we have to sit like sitting ducks and die. We could actually defend ourselves. And if they attack us during a sacred month, when it comes time to retaliate, we could actually retaliate during the sacred month as well, if that is strategically advantageous. Otherwise, we would refrain and respect the sacred month. And then coming to the end, spend your wealth for the cause of Allah and do not be thrown to destruction by your own hands. Be charitable. Allah loves those who are charitable. And again, you might ask, okay, what's the connection between the spending here and the verses that preceded? The connection is that any war effort will require funding, and the funding will largely come from voluntary contributions from the Muslim individuals. This verse also connects with what follows, because following this, we'll be dealing with performing Hajj, and performing Hajj requires some expenditure, especially these days. So we couldn't perform the Hajj from abroad last year, but the Hajj was limited only to those who are already within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We hope that, inshallah, the COVID-19 will be kept under control for the coming Hajj season, and inshallah, we'll have a chance to go back there soon. So that involves some expenditure, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward those who spend their money in these good ways. So that's the connection, that this verse connects with the ones preceding it in dealing with spending for the war necessities, and it connects with what comes after it, and that it speaks about Hajj, which requires its own expenditures. Okay. So to sum up then, we have looked at new laws for a new community. We're still looking at new laws for a new community, and that discussion will continue. But under that broad heading, tonight we have dealt with regulations governing justified warfare in verses 189 to 195. Now, I will spend a few minutes to look at the details of the verses that we have just read only in English translation. But let me give you the heads up that next week we'll be dealing with the procedure of the pilgrimage. That's in verses number 196 to 203. And some remaining topics in this chapter under that broader designation of new laws for a new community would include charity, and which is already being intimated in the verse that we just last read. But there would be a longer section dealing with charity, and we'll deal with commercial law and family law among what is to follow. So let us then look at some of the verses in detail. I'm going to skip this one, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَهِلَّةِ, unless you have a question regarding it, inshallah. The translations and transliteration that I'm about to present come from this website, alquran.info. So let's look at this. وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Fight in the way of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not like transgressors. Some commentators have pointed out that the verb qatala in Arabic actually involves reciprocity. So it's two persons doing the action. It's not just one attacking the other. So it involves some reciprocity. So when the Quran is saying fight against those who are fighting against you, just that verb itself, qatil, That verb itself involves reciprocity, but the Quran verse here is even more clear in that it adds those who are fighting against you. So it's even doubly clear that we're not to attack others who are not fighting against us. And the end of this verse says, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا, and do not transgress. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Certainly Allah does not like those who transgress. So we are to observe limits and proceed in a reasonable fashion. Not going to excess. وقاتلوهم حتى لا وقتلوهم حيث ثقفتموهم, and slay them wherever you find them. So in my translation, I have rewarded it in such a way that it flows nicely. In the Arabic here, see, the Arabic text is put forward in a way that has its own rhyme, its rhythm, its own pulling power. And to capture that in English, sometimes it's not done by keeping the exact order of the Arabic words as we translate them into English. Let's see how the translators have done it here. And kill them wherever you confront them, and expel them from where they expelled you. For faithlessness is graver than killing. But do not fight them near the holy mosque unless they fight you therein. But if they fight you, kill them. Such is the requital of the faithless. Now, a few things have to be said about this. First of all, they translated al-fitna as faithlessness. Al-fitna does not necessarily mean faithlessness. Al-fitna actually relates to much of what this whole surah is about. That's why it is important for us in looking at a surah to look at it holistically and look at the Quran holistically as well. So at the beginning of this surah, you remember that there was a description of the creation of Adam, and the angels ask, are you going to create a being on earth who is going to cause fasad and shed blood? So fasad is like chaos, and this is a better description of what is going on here. The Quran is against fitna as against chaos, and we'll see this in a later verse to follow as well, perhaps verse number 203 when we come to it, that there are people who are causing chaos, fasad on the earth by destroying crops and property. So this is the kind of fitna that is being talked about here. The fitna can mean a lot of things. It can mean an upheaval. It can mean civil strife, like in civil war, and so on. But it could also mean persecution. And this meaning finds itself in some other verses of the Quran. For example, in Surah Al-Buruj, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ فَتَنُوا الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, those who persecute the believing men and women. So the verb for persecute there in Arabic is fatanu, which is from the same verbal form, the masdar fitna. So fitna in that verse means persecution. And in this verse here, obviously, it means the same thing. So the persecution, we would have to say then, if we're translating literally word for word and keeping the same order, persecution is worse than slaughter. And one would then step back and ask, well, how is persecution worse than slaughter? Well, the answer to that is that we shouldn't translate it so literally, but we should understand that the persecution which is going on might be ended by a lesser evil, which is to kill the persecutor. So this is why I rendered it by saying it goes something like this. And you may even kill the persecutor if that will be a way of ending the greater evil of persecution. So something of that nature. So if we just translate it word by word in a stark manner in the English, as our good friends have done here, then that may not capture adequately the spirit of the Quranic text. So it's not faithlessness necessarily. It is the persecution of the believers. So the believers were being persecuted. The Prophet, peace be upon him, and his faithful followers had to migrate away from that scene of violence. And now they're still being persecuted by the enemies advancing to go and attack their city. And the Muslims had to defend themselves. So now, see how this verse ends. كَذَلِكَ جَزَاءُ الْكَافِرِينَ. It's not just any kafir. It's not so much a reward for their faithlessness. It is a just settlement for their continued persecution. It is a way of ending their persecution. Okay, so فَإِنْ انْتَهَوْا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. So now this is very clear. If they cease what they're doing, then Allah is going to forgive them, and naturally Muslims are expected to forgive them as well. وَقَاتِلُوهُمْ حَتَّى لَا تَكُونَ فِتْنَةٌ وَيَكُونَ الدِّينُ لِلَّهِ. Here too, our good friends have translated it as fight them until faithlessness is no more. No, that doesn't seem to be the point. Otherwise, it would mean that Muslims have to continue fighting with non-Muslims until there is no non-Muslim. There is no lack of faith, and Muslims would be embroiled in a continuous warfare from the beginning to the end. And unfortunately, many translators have gone to that extent of translating it like this. But that in my humble judgment, is not the correct way. And fitna here should not be translated as faithlessness, but it should be translated as persecution. So this verse is saying, in my humble judgment, and you may continue to fight them until the persecution has ended. And وَيَكُونَ الدِّينُ لِلَّهِ. Now, deen, the word deen could mean religion, but it could also mean something like a debt, and it could also mean, in the case of Yawmuddin, it is the day of recompense when the reward will be given out, a day of accounting and balancing of things. So this balance and the judgment of God ruling on that day, that is probably closer to the meaning here. Also, we have in Surah Yusuf that Yusuf alayhi salam wanted to take his brother, but the Quran says, مَا كَانَ لَهُ أَن يَأْخُذَ أَخَاهُ فِي دِينِ الْمَلِكِ. It wasn't possible for him to take his brother according to the law of the king. So everybody translates that verse in which the word deen occurs as law. So they translate the word deen as law in that verse in Surah Yusuf. So we should rightly ask, why not translate the word deen here in the same vein, that this is the law of God? You are then permitted to fight with the persecutors until they end their persecution and the law of God reigns. And here it's not in a way, it's just simply the law of God, like, the Muslims now are finally happy because the entire Sharia has been established. No, the idea is the ethics which are there in the behind the Islamic law. This should be established, which means that people would not be persecuted on account of their religion. Muslims will be free to practice their faith, and non-Muslims will be free to practice their faith as well. And what this means is that if there is a group of people who are suffering religious persecution, though they're not Muslims, Muslims would be duty-bound to come to their rescue and defend them. We would not agree with what they believe, but we would defend their right to have their beliefs and to practice their faith. So, to continue then, verse 194, Ash-Shahr al-Haram bi Shahr al-Haram. Now, the Quranic text is very brief, and the language is very terse. And sometimes, in order to understand it, the Mufassirun, the commentators who have written, the great Arabic commentators on the Quran and classical history, have had to assume what they refer to as a hadth, that there is a certain thing that is implied in what is being said, but it's not being stated explicitly. So it's as if the Quran says a word and then leaves a blank and then says the other word, and then you have to fill out the blank in between. So the Mufassirun do that. With a verse like this also, we have had to fill in some blanks. Here, the translators have rendered it a sacred month for a sacred month. So they've gone literally with it, Shahr al-Haram bi Shahr al-Haram. But then it doesn't convey to the English reader what is being spoken about. So to fill out the blanks and make it more comprehensive, I've said that if they attack you in a sacred month, then you are allowed to fight them in a sacred month as well, because the law of equity here prevails, equitable retaliation, so that what they have done to you, you can go against them to that extent, but you're not allowed to exceed, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like those who exceed, and He is with those who observe proper limits. And then the final verse, this requires little comment. So that is what I wanted to present for today. And inshallah, next week we will look at the verses regarding pilgrimage, and we'll continue to study Surah Al-Baqarah until the very end, inshallah. And we are getting close to that end. So for those of you who have joined us online, at this point, I would need to return to the local community and deal with their questions. This is the night I've reserved for them. As for the wider international community, I will be speaking with you again, inshallah, on Sunday at 1:30 in the afternoon, Toronto time. So please do join me for that. In the meantime, I want to bid you salam, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will protect you and all of your loved ones from COVID-19 and from every other sickness, distress, and stress. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you and all of your loved ones safety and good health and well-being in this life, and everlasting happiness in the life hereafter. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unite us all under the shade of His throne on the day of judgment and in Jannah forever. So I look forward to speaking with you again on Sunday, if not before that. Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.